Today we're going to cover the life of John Bunyan because I think it's critical to really understanding the book really well and seeing what part of this is autobiographical, what part of this Christian experience is indicative of the walk for everybody. What are basically the commentaries that he's making on what church is. Um, so to know and understand his life is important. Then the following weeks we'll cover a couple stages at a time. If you can read any version, they're all the same. But what's interesting about Pilgrim's Progress, it's actually kind of makes it challenging to cover in a book study, is if you can get a bunch of different books, they're not all divided up the same. When Bunyan wrote the book, he didn't write chapter 1, chapter 2. He just kind of wrote it all out, and then people over time have divided it up accordingly. So if you get 10 different versions, then you will have 10 different chapter divisions. If you've got the Lithos Press version, will be the one that we're using. But you can read any version. They're all now. I will say this is an edited, updated English version of the book. So I recommend this definitely for a first reading. Now, if you talk to our dear pastor, this is his major fault in his life. He doesn't like this book. We forgive him for it. Maybe he can hear me right now. But one of the reasons he doesn't care for it is because he was made to read it in the original English, and written how it was originally written. If you've seen that kind of old text where it's like that, an S is an F and all that kind of stuff, that would be awful. All right, but that doesn't have anything to do with the book. But anyway, I recommend this version because it's updated English. It's kind of a good middle ground. You get some that they say are modern English. I think you do lose some of the stuff. This keeps some of the original text, and you'll see it set off in the margins like, hey, this is the word, this is what it means. But I do recommend that when you're reading it, have your phone, or if you still own a dictionary, have one of those. I don't even know that we own a dictionary, but yeah, let's get one. Okay, that's great. Just for old time's sake. But yeah, if you get something, you're reading it, it's a temptation to think like, oh, I wonder what that means, and you just keep on reading it. It does add a lot to your reading. If you just take a second, look it up, and really try and apply it. And then there's a lot, especially in the first couple chapters, there are a lot of pictures that is descriptions of and scenes that take some thinking. So anyway, I encourage you. Again, we'll go this week over Bunyan, and then next week we'll cover these first two scenes, which is the stages, the city of destruction, and then the interpreter's house. The class will be so much better for you if you just take some time and you read the book. I know I taught this on a Wednesday night, I don't know, a year or so ago, and it was probably half and half the people that were reading the book that would come to kind of discuss it, and then the other half, they were just hoping they could glean everything they needed to from the book from just coming to the class. That's okay, but I just would really encourage you. I think, in less than 30 to 45 minutes a week, you can do all the reading. You can spread that out across how many ever days. It's definitely doable. So I do commend reading the book to you. But we'll cover those first two stages next week. That's just my plug to make sure you keep up with the reading. Next week, though, I said next week. I've been using next week. What I mean is next class. Because next week is the marriage retreat, right? So there's a spotlight next Sunday. We won't have class. If a bunch of people are going on the marriage retreat, you won't miss class. We'll pick up the following week. So for the first session, you got 2 weeks to do your reading, okay? And hopefully you'll maybe even get ahead. But let's dive into the life of Bunyan. I'm just curious, anybody in here read anything from Bunyan besides Pilgrim's Progress? Have you read Pilgrim's Progress? So he's got quite the catalog of books. This is a span of his life. but we'll talk about this later. But he wrote. I think he just wrote when he became a believer. He wrote a few books before he was in prison. Then while he was in prison, I think he wrote somewhere around 40 books while he was in prison, and then just a few after he was out of prison. He spent the last 10 years of his life not in prison. Um, so this you definitely get the sense from his writings of where he was in the context that he was living in. It was a unique thing that his life was spared, because many of these Puritan preachers, many of them were killed, were martyred. But is this quote here? There's a series by John Piper that he does a lot of these mini biographies called "The Swans Are Not Silent." That's a great resource. They're little books. You can get these little books, and he'll do 4 or 5, maybe 6 biographies on people. And he does one on John Bunyan, which is really good. You can go and you can even listen to his. I think there's like an hour and a half lecture that he gives on John Bunyan. But that's what he calls it. To live upon God that is invisible. He gives little titles for each of these little biographies, and that is Bunyan. That it's his distillation of who John Bunyan is. And I think this is a great way to set up Bunyan's life, because he had a very difficult life. If you're aware of Bunyan and aware of the context of Pilgrim's Progress, you'll know that it was written while he was in prison. And that is who he was. So this here, I love this quote from him. "I was made to see that if ever I would suffer rightly, I must first pass a sentence of death upon everything that can be properly called a thing of this life, even to reckon myself, my wife, my children, my health, my enjoyment, and all as dead to me, and myself as dead to them. The second was to live upon God that is invisible." If you see from his Christian life, really all of his life, that's the lesson that he was learning, was to depend and to live upon God that is invisible, because in a lot of ways everything that he had was taken away from him. Well, let's dive into it and look here. 1928 is when he's born in Elstow, England. He grew up in a modest family. They weren't wealthy people. They weren't extremely poor. His dad was a tinker. That is, he worked on metal goods. He would fix pots and pans. You or I, if we have a pot and pan that goes bad, we just throw it in the garbage and buy another one, right? But they, obviously back then, if you had something you needed, one of these things worked on, you would call a tinker. They would come to your house. They would fix your pots and pans. So his dad traveled all over, and Bunyan himself grew up to follow in his dad's footsteps as a tinker. And they claim that they actually have this portable anvil, which is kind of like an odd concept to me. I don't know how portable any kind of anvil is. But as Bunyan would go around, as his dad would go around, he would carry this anvil with him. He had to take this anvil where he went, and a lot of folks think that you have this picture of Christian from the book Pilgrim's Progress who has this incredible burden on his back. No doubt, Bunyan probably had in mind having to carry his anvil from town to town to do this stuff, or thinking of his dad as he's growing up. Bunyan would have attended church growing up because it was required. It was demanded of everybody because of the Anglican Church of England. So everybody had to go to church. So he would have grown up going to church. But he was not close to God at all. He was far from God. He lived a rough lifestyle. Was a tough kid. This is all that you can read about this in his spiritual autobiography. But he growing up was rough. But he had as he looked back on his life, there are several things that happened even when he was a kid that he saw as a divine intervention that preserved his life. For instance, he almost drowned 2 times as a kid and was saved 2 times. At one point, he was about to be bitten by a snake, and he grabs this snake, and the lore is that he snatched the fangs out of this snake's mouth. I don't know if that's possible, but that's what they say happened. But there were several times when he says he almost died. And so, as later in his life, when he comes to faith in Christ, he does see that he was preserved for a purpose. Um, but then in 1644, it was a very difficult year for Bunyan. Bunyan's sister and his mother both die in this year, in the same year. Um, of, but within 2 months, so his mom dies. Within 2 months, his dad remarries another woman. He gets a new mom. All of a sudden, he's, still fairly young, and he really does not get along with this lady. So he joins. He joins the army. Now, also part of the context that's important to understand, there is a civil war that's taking place during this time. You've got the king that feels most of it's centered around who can worship, what can they do, who's allowed to gather. And then you have the parliament that feels one way, you have the king that feels another way. And so there's this turmoil, and much of Bunyan's years in and out of prison center around this reality, this kind of the religious oppression of the time. But he joins the war on the parliamentary side and engages there. This is another point in his life where he has what he would call as a near-death experience. A fellow soldier comes to him one night and says, "Hey, you and I we go back and forth on the same job. You're supposed to be doing the patrol here tonight, but I got something I need to do tomorrow night. Can we switch?" Bunyan says, "No problems. We'll switch that." And well, that night, when that other soldier is on patrol on Bunyan's behalf, is shot and killed. Bunyan sees this as an act of God, and he, again tries to begin to do right. He starts to be influenced by this, but it's not long lasting. It never transfers into faith in Christ. That's really kind of the theme, as he would say, of his young life. He was riddled with bad dreams. He would feel the weight and the pressure of all of the sin. Have a lot of these dreams. He'd wake up and think, okay, I need to change my life, change my ways. But it just would never translate into a relationship with Christ. He really just didn't have that knowledge, which is interesting. You think of all these years that he would have spent going to church, spending week in and week out in church because it was mandated. Yet he has no way of knowing how to be saved. And that's interesting. 1647, his regiment is disbanded, and he returns home. But at the time that he has there in the military, serves as a kind of a background for a lot of his writing. There is a book that he's written called The Holy War, which is a battle for man's soul. Okay, sometimes his in his allegories the pictures are vague and veiled. This one is not so veiled, right? It's a battle for man's soul. And it's another great allegory. There's actually this Lithos Press, the people that made this blue Pilgrim's Progress. They've turned that into a kid's book that I commend to you as well. It's a great resource. But it's the incredible book. But anyway, it's that his time there served him well for his writings. He goes on. 1649, in that year, Charles I is executed. This was a big deal. Just to kind of give you an idea, this would be like if we heard today Donald Trump has been beheaded, not shot, not assassinated, but beheaded. That's kind of the tenor of the day there in England. That's what's happening. But in that same year, Bunyan marries a wife. Oddly enough, we do not know her name. We do not know this lady's name. That is fascinating to me. All that he's written, yeah, no commentary on that. What? What's that? Yeah, yeah. But she gives Bunyan 4 kids. They have 4 kids together, one of whom is blind. but for whatever reason, Bunyan never mentions their name.
Does he mention his kids' names?
He mentions his kids' names. Yeah, I know some of you already written him off. Like, I'm not reading this guy. Why would we read this guy? It gets worse. It gets worse, honestly. Um, yeah. No, I mean, there's no indication that he. I think it is a reasonable question. Certainly, from you thinking somebody from that period of time, it's like, okay, does this guy mistreat his wife? There's no indication that he mistreats her. It is odd that he doesn't talk about her. He will marry again to this lady will die. He will marry again to a lady named Elizabeth that we know about. Um, you know, and Elizabeth is a remarkable lady. I'll tell you a story about Elizabeth here in a minute, um, but even so, it's this first lady that he marries is part of his spiritual journey. She is, of course, Bunyan himself does not have much money. He marries a lady that does not have much money. What she comes with as part of her dowry are two books that are both Christian books. And as a young married couple, they read these books together, and it radically changes Bunyan's life. He's intrigued by all the stuff that he reads. The two books are The Plain Man's Pathway to Heaven by Arthur Dent and The Practice of Piety by Lewis Bailey. But they get these books. This is literally all that she brings to the table from in this monetarily, and but they read these books together. But again, Bunyan, he reads these, he begins to follow the advice of these books, but yet without Christ. If you've read the book, you will know, and this is one of the great questions that I think a lot of people have, and I'll encourage you as you read this week and next week, however you sort that out. I would ask you, when does Christian become saved? When is Christian saved? Okay, is it when he turns to follow Christ? Is it when because there's even this sign. I'll give you a clue here. There's a point in which he passes through this narrow gate, the wicket gate. But he passes through this gate, but he keeps his burden on his back. It's not until he's at the cross until the burden is loosed from his back, and it says, and it rolls into the sepulcher. I don't remember what word this version uses, but the tomb of Jesus. This burden, so the burden falls off his back at the foot of the cross. So I encourage you to think: at what point does Christian become saved in the book? When is he a believer? Is it when he leaves the city of destruction, when he passes through the wicket gate, or when the burden is released from his back? I know the answer. I don't know. Anyway. But it's an interesting thought. But I bring that up to just say you can see through Bunyan's life why he wrote Christian story like he did, because here's Bunyan aware of the burden of his sin even from a young age. He has these dreams. He has several times in his life when he's trying to do the right thing. He does have this keen awareness. He reads these books with his wife. There's some other little vignettes, stories that we'll read about, that you see Bunyan is confronted with the reality of his sin, and this is another one of those times. One time, and another time, of course, he was trying, but yet in vain, to live a good life, but he cussed a lot. That was he played games on Sundays. These were one of the two things that he really wanted to change. Was he was a big cusser. Like Roxanne. No, I'm kidding. And yeah, okay, yeah, that's right. That's okay. A little cussing's fine. Um, and he played games on Sunday, but here he was. Yeah, also like Roxanne. This is actually her biography. Um, But one day he's outside. He's with friends. Oh, and this is interesting to me too, because later in his life he's following Christ. And one thing that he was really bitter at his dad about was his dad taught him to cuss, and he was like, he really wishes his dad hadn't taught him to do that. But it's purist or Puritan fashion. But anyway, so but he recounts protested. This lady comes and starts fussing at him. He's outside talking with his friends and whatever. I guess he's cussing up a blue streak. And this lady comes running out. She protested that I cursed and swore at the most fearful rate that she was made to tremble to hear me. Now, and this was thinking. He described this lady as a lady of the tavern, right? This is in his so. This isn't a lady from the church coming to fuss at him. This is a lady from the tavern. And she told me further that I was the ungodliest fellow for swearing that she ever heard in all her life, and that I, by thus doing, was able to spoil all the youth in the whole town, if they came but in my company. So he's out with his buddies, and this lady just comes and berates him for all of his cussing, and it really convicts him. He's ashamed by this. He can't believe he's had this interaction, and he tried to clean up his language, and he does. So much so that people begin to notice. They were shocked, and Bunyan loves this. He sees that people notice this about him, and it kind of puffs him up a little bit, and it's fuel somewhat. But you probably know, good behavior just for good behavior's sake at some point kind of runs out. Yep, feel free to put those on the floor. Yeah, it just doesn't last. This is a great kind of point to step aside and think about the gospel. Our good works, outside of being fueled by the person and work of Jesus Christ, really turns into more of a burden than it does a freedom. And when we do good works for good work's sake or to be seen by other people, sure, can it last a little while? Absolutely it can. Does it feel good? It does. But it really just doesn't have the lasting power like being fueled by the gospel. And this is true. Bunyan's conduct was clean. His church attendance became regular at this point. He was reading good books, and likely many people around him would call him a Christian, but he was not. It is a great time for us to think about our own life. Our walk with Christ is not determined by what we do, but our faith in Jesus and what He's accomplished on our behalf. Outside of trusting in what He's done for our salvation, trying to earn it, anything outside of our faith in Christ alone and following Him would result in an eternity in hell. This is where Bunyan was at this time. But in 1650, he had traveled to another town. There he was making his life as a tinker, doing this repair work on stuff. He's got his anvil with him. He's gone to this other town, and he's outside of this church is a group of ladies that are just hanging out on the steps of these buildings, and they're just spending time together, talking about things of the Lord. And there's such a grace and graciousness, with just depth of reality of the scriptures and love for one another, love for the gospel that he has never seen before. And he kind of lingers around these ladies just to listen to more of what they have to say. And as the days goes on that he spends time there, he keeps finding reasons to go back to this area where these ladies are hanging out. And I love this picture. This is, it's not some grandiose thing. It's not a Damascus Road experience. It is just faithful church ladies. He describes them as poor. They weren't highly educated. It wasn't like, they were seminary. They were just ladies that loved the Lord and were being faithful. And it was obvious. It was apparent. And as he goes back and he begins to interact with them, they engage him more, and then they introduce him to John Gifford, who becomes Bunyan's pastor. And Gifford has Bunyan begin to read some things, and Bunyan has a time. I can't remember if I wrote the. He's been confronted with all of these thoughts and ideas. John Gifford is having him read all of this stuff. He reads a commentary by Luther on Galatians, there was a couple other some sermons that he heard it was a sermon from John Gifford from Song of Solomon that he heard that really resonated with him. He was walking through a field one day by himself. He said a powerful thought came to mind: Thy righteousness in heaven. He had spent all these years trying to have his righteousness, and at the thinking on this writing from Galatians, the sermon, he said, "It's your righteousness that I need." And it's at that moment he trusted Christ for his salvation, and applied Christ's righteousness to himself, and that was his salvation experience. Well, he joins this church there with John Gifford as his pastor, and another thing I would say, the kind of a key in reading the Pilgrim's Progress, as you read it, there's the character of the evangelist, and that's who I picture as John Gifford is to Christian and Bunyan. So I kind of like to think of Gifford there. Gifford. Well, let's go. As Bunyan begins to be involved in this church, he becomes a deacon. Bunyan relocates his family to become a member of this church and participate there. And just a year later, Gifford dies. It's a sad story, but I mean, they had a lot of time of discipleship and investment together. Again, Bunyan was a part of this, but he was a deacon of the church. The other deacons kind of come together and they approach Bunyan and say, "Hey, we think you ought to start preaching." And so Bunyan does start preaching. It was a little bit of a different scenario. We think of preaching primarily on Sunday mornings, maybe on Wednesdays, if you come to midweek, but for them, they would send preachers out all the time. They would go preach in a field or in a barn somewhere. Later, when Bunyan gets out of prison, he buys a farm and a barn, and he preaches out of a barn. They still had their traditional Sunday services, but they would have been preaching all the time. And it's interesting because Bunyan wasn't the pastor of this church, but he was a preacher of the church, and they would send him out. And they with just less than a day's notice, they'd be like, "Hey, Bunyan's going to be preaching on Friday night over here," and like 1,500 people would come and hear him preach. When you can imagine being in a field somewhere, in a barn somewhere, with 1,500 people and no amplification, it's like he's got to be a good preacher, So, but here you see Bunyan begin to grow in his walk with the Lord, and this is from Grace Abounding, his autobiography. He says, "Indeed, I had been as one sent to them from the dead. I went myself in chains to preach to them in chains, and carried that fire in my own conscience that I persuaded them to be aware of." I love that. "I can truly say, and that without dissembling, that when I have been to preach, I have gone full of guilt and terror, even to the pulpit door, and there it had been taken off, and I've been at liberty in my mind until I've done my work. And then immediately, even before I could get down the pulpit stairs, I've been as bad as I was before. Yet God carried me on, but surely with a strong hand, for neither guilt nor hell could take me off my work." He felt convicted and called to preach, and he did so with the full awareness of what God had done for him and in him, and that's how he carried on. 1658, his first wife dies, which I alluded to earlier. The lady, we don't know her name, she passes and leaves Bunyan with four kids. In 59, he meets Elizabeth, and she is instrumental to the success of his life in every aspect. But in just a year later, you have Charles II, who returns from exile, become king. Bunyan's arrested for illegal preaching. His wife Elizabeth, she's young. She's a young lady at this time. She's pregnant, but on hearing the news of Bunyan's arrest, she goes into labor. She labors for 8 days and then loses the baby. again, another sad story for Bunyan's life. The deal was is Bunyan, he's preaching. His preaching is increasing. So there's all this pressure on the separatists and the nonconformists. These people that say they're not going to meet in this Church of England. They're not going to meet at these places. You'll see nonconformists starting to come up a lot here because these are the people that will be in prison. They don't want to conform to what the official religion is, what they're having to keep this common book of prayer and stuff, and they're saying, hey, no. So as Bunyan begins to preach a lot, well, the word gets out. The government starts to get worried, and so that's when they go and they tell Bunyan, or they put a word out like, hey, he cannot preach. Well, Bunyan knows that he's not supposed to preach, and he sees that it's very likely that if he gets up and preach, he will be arrested. But he's convinced that if he doesn't, it would set an awful standard, that other people would lose heart, that other people would cower, and so he goes to preach anyway. And just as he's about to step into the pulpit, that's when he's arrested and taken away. And that's when his wife, then pregnant, loses that child a little bit later. In 1661, Bunyan is sentenced to prison. Elizabeth here, this is kind of one of the stories that's so special about her. He writes a letter and asks Elizabeth to present this letter to these judges so that he can be freed. So he gives her this thing. Elizabeth takes multiple copies. She gets multiple copies of this letter made, and she goes to London. Here she is, single mom at this point. She goes to London with these letters. She's at first rejected by the judges. So she waits several months. They say, hey, if you just wait again, these judges will meet again. So she waits several months to be able to deliver this letter. Again, waits for them. And just before the meeting, she finds one of the judges who will be there, and she delivers this copy in person. And then she hears that the other judge is going to be passing through on his carriage going this way. And so she waits, she hides and waits. And just as his carriage is coming by, she jumps out and throws this letter into his carriage. So he gets this thing and reads it. Nothing happens because of that. She meets with him another time. She's told that there's nothing that they can do. And then she finds out where they're having dinner one night and shows up there to deliver the letter again and plead with them. There's this exchange that she has with the judges. I think again gives a great picture of who the type of lady she is. She's been to London with one petition. Now she's met from these judges. They ask her, would he stop preaching? Would Bunyan stop preaching? She says, my Lord, he dares not leave off preaching as long as he can speak. They say, what is the need of talking? She says, there is no need for this, my Lord, for I have 4 small children that cannot help themselves, one of which is blind, and we have nothing to live upon but the charity of good people. Matthew Hale, the judge, with pity, asks if she really has 4 children so young. She says, my Lord, I am but mother-in-law, that is stepmother to them, having not been married to him yet 2 full years. Indeed, I was with child when my husband was first apprehended, but being young and unaccustomed to such things, I, being smayed at the news, fell into labor, and so continued for 8 days, and then was delivered, but my child died. Hale's moved, but the other judges are hardened and speak against him. They say, he is a mere tinker. She says, yes, and because he is a tinker and a poor man, therefore he is despised and cannot have justice. Chester, the other enraged judge, says Bunyan will preach and do as he wishes. She says he's going to keep on preaching. She says he preaches nothing but the word of God. And in rage, another judge says, well, all he does is run up and down doing harm. She says, no, my Lord, it is not so. God hath owned him and done much good by him. The angry man continues, his doctrine is the doctrine of the devil. She replies, my Lord, when the righteous judge shall appear, it will be known that his doctrine is not the doctrine of the devil. Then it said of a biographer on Bunyan, Elizabeth Bunyan was simply an English peasant woman, but she couldn't have spoken with more dignity had she been crowned queen. Uh, Magnificent lady and such boldness. And you think about somebody that would have had to have been um, in lockstep with John Bunyan as he goes to prison, because it is true that if any moment, he has so many people that love and feel affection for him. Even the jailers, all these people say, if you'll just say that you won't preach, we'll let you go. Um, and he says, if I'm released today, I'll preach tomorrow. So Elizabeth, willingly, at least by all accounts, participates in this, uh, but no success there. In 1662, this continues to grow. Over 2,000 nonconformist preachers are ejected from their pulpits. And this is important to know, because you have this prison where Bunyan is. Piper, I was listening to some stuff from Piper. He said, don't think of this as worse than it is, and don't think of it as better than it is, because Bunyan's in prison. He's not being tortured, but he is in prison. But he also is allowed to leave from time to time. For a season, they let him go out in the evenings and preach. So he has to be back in prison. And you have all these other preachers that are coming and going. So here they're in this prison, and there's, just kind of, the prisons are pretty full, but it's all a bunch of Baptist preachers. And they'll say, he said on like Sunday mornings, they would be like, all right, buddy, get it, come on, deliver the word. And somebody would get up and preach on Sunday morning in the prison. This does happen for a while for Bunyan, even that he'll go out and preach in the community. It would be late at night and be in darkness. But kind of the jailer would be like, hey, dude, I feel like I can trust you. You go and preach. Just me and you both get in trouble if you're not back, okay? And Bunyan does that for a while. And that kind of comes and goes off and on while his time in prison. He is allowed to see his family. In prison, they would only provide for the prisoner some bread and water. So you would have had to have somebody else coming and seeing you on a regular basis. He would have been brought some stuff by his family. It's said that he made shoelaces while he was in prison to help support his family. He likely would have, if you've got that little plastic tip on the end of your shoelaces, he probably was putting the little metal tip on the end of shoelaces. That's what he would have done. And that's how he would have given that to his family, so they could sell that and live off of that. And then his church, he would have been very, very much involved in his church. It would have been a lot of people from his church coming in and out of prison during that time. Many other preachers are killed during this time. When Bunyan goes into prison, he has 2 books with him. Does anybody know what they are? You can probably guess one. Okay, you got the easy one. The other one is Fox's Book of Martyrs. So those are his 2 books, the Bible and Fox's Book of Martyrs, and those are his companions for his time in prison. It probably would, I've got to think, you're spending all this time in prison, it would likely help your perspective if the other book you're reading is about martyrs. People have a worse scenario than you. But these are very, very difficult times. Bunyan's suffering left a mark on all of his writings and his work. George Whitefield, a famous preacher, said of Pilgrim's Progress, it smells of the prison. It was written when the author was confined in Bedford jail, and ministers never write or preach so well as when under the cross. The Spirit of Christ and of glory then rest upon them. Yes, sir. Yeah, this is Elizabeth. He's married to Elizabeth during this time. Sure. Yeah. That's a great question. Yeah, so in the book Christiana, his wife, um, that's part of the when he's in the city of destruction, he's going to tell his wife regularly, like, "Hey, we've got to go," and she just kind of is dismissive of it. And then when he finally leaves and goes on his whole journey, he does so without his wife and his kids. It could be. I don't. I've wondered the same thing if his wife, what the situation was with his wife. Yeah, you got to ask. Yeah, why doesn't he write more about it? That's a great question. Now, part of the reason he wrote part two, we were not going to cover part two, but I commend it to you. Part of the reason he wrote part two is because everybody's like, well, what about Christiana? What happens to Christiana? And so part two follows the life of Christiana, and he kind of answers a lot of the questions that come up about from part one. Um, yeah, so we'll bring that up from time to time. So the fragrance of affliction was on Bunyan and most of what he wrote. Um, you know, the I think one of the reasons Puritans are still being read today was because of the profit of that is what they gained from their entire experience. Their experience during that time was one of persecution and suffering. Um, this if you read many Puritans, you get that sense from them that um, this was a great challenge. And then while in prison, this is what Bunyan says. Of course, they would come to visit him and then have to leave. He said, "The parting of my wife and poor children have oft been to me in this place as the pulling the flesh from my bones." And that not only because I'm somewhat too fond of these great mercies, but also because I should have often brought to my mind the many hardships, miseries, and wants that my poor family was like to meet with, should I be taken from them, especially my poor blind child, who lay nearer my heart than all I had beside. Um, this this is why Pilgrim's Progress is marked so much by this trial and difficulty. You see Bunyan's life here, just kind of back and forth in so many ways. Every day, wondering if this would be his last day. He probably did see a lot of people that he knew and loved be put to death, sentenced to death, and he had the whole experience. I'm sure he had some really incredible experiences where he felt like he met with God as he's listening to other preachers preach to him in prison. He's seeing God work and move. And yet, to hear him describe when he has to say goodbye to his wife and kids as if the flesh is being pulled from his bones. And again, as we read later in Pilgrim's Progress, there is Doubting Castle and the Giant Despair, where Christian and his companion despair for life itself. They actually contemplate suicide together. They think how they might kill themselves, and no doubt this was based on Bunyan's own experience. He does have regular dreams where he thinks it would be better for him to die. And that's when he talks about this. He thinks, but man, what would it do to my family? How would they survive? So it's, as you can imagine, a very dark time. 1666, Bunyan publishes an account of his life and all of his dramatic spiritual experiences. Um, this Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. This is a great book. It's probably the best Puritan autobiography that's been written that I highly recommend to you. But this you see the perseverance of Bunyan throughout all of this. Even on these dark times, he knows because of his faith in Christ, he has to press on. He has to continue. He has to write. He has to work. And he does some incredible stuff. I think I thought of Daniel 11. Those who do wickedly against the covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery. This is Daniel 11:32. But the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. This Bunyan lived this to a great degree. I love that. Be strong and carry out great exploits. This is what Bunyan did. He wrote, again, many books during this time. A lot of the sermons that he would write, he would come back and transcribe and be able to give out. He wrote children's books. He wrote poems. There's one really interesting poem that he wrote. It's about this man and a spider. And this man meets this spider, and he fusses at the spider for being so ugly and weak and poisonous. And the spider looks back at the man and says, "Well, at least I'm doing what God has made me to do, and this is how God made me. Even the poison that I have is part of God's design. The glory of God in you is obscured because of sin." And then in this interaction with this man and this spider, until the man is at the end, is like, "You're right. I'm very sorry. You're like an amazing thing, and I will go and confess all my sins." Typical kind of Puritan writing, but it is interesting. But anyway, it's all these things. He's probably in there, sees a spider in the corner of this room, and what else is he going to do but write some masterful piece of work? So in 1671, this is very interesting to me. While in prison, is appointed as the pastor of his church in Bedford. Um, you know, that's a great church growth plan for you. It's welcome to service. Our pastor is in prison, um, but still, people would visit him and go, and he did much of his work from prison. He felt still very much connected to those people. Again, many of whom would have been coming to visit him there, and he's doing. I say visit him. Many of them would have been imprisoned with him at a time. And spent time together, but they decide together that they want to call Bunyan as pastor. He remained pastor of this church until his death. But I think of what incredible, just what beauty this expresses of this body, that they value what this man does more than they value really a lot of the things that people end up fussing at preachers about. This guy, Bunyan, was not at people's graduation parties, but he was delivering the word, and he took that very seriously and pastored them in many ways, even from the prison cell. 1672, Charles II issues a declaration of indulgence, allowing nonconformists to obtain a license to preach. So Bunyan's free. He gets out of prison and immediately applies for a license, and he gets the license, and he goes and preaches. This is when he's released here. That's when he goes and buys this piece of land and gets this barn where he gathers regularly. People can come and listen to him preach. He's preaching at his church on Sunday, but he's also preaching in many other times. Spoiler alert, he will go back to prison after this. It's interesting. He's writing Pilgrim's Progress during this time. He's written all this other stuff. It's kind of towards this end here when he's writing the Pilgrim's Progress. And then he goes back. When he goes back to prison again, is when he finishes the Pilgrim's Progress. And there's a point in the story at which you can tell. He's writing, and then he says, just kind of randomly, he's like, "Then I woke from my dream, and I went back into my dream." And he continues the story. It's just that stark, and many think, and I agree, that this was that time. He gets free from prison. He starts doing this other stuff. He goes back to prison. He's like, "All right, I'm back in my dream." And because that's, the full title of the Pilgrim's Progress, the end of it is "Delivered Under the Similitude of a Dream." And I think part of it for Bunyan was that he's kind of zeroes in here. But anyway, it's interesting. You'll see if when you're reading, you can spot the time when Bunyan's freed from prison. I think you will notice.
Do you think, practically speaking, it could have been that he had time to write in prison that he didn't?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's why I think when he goes out of prison, he's like, okay, no doubt he's like all the stuff that he can do. And again, he's preaching. He's probably,
He doesn't have hours to write.
yeah, he's got other stuff that he's doing, and no doubt he would have been wanting to do for years. He's like, I'm going to the grocery store just because I can, There was probably a lot of that. I'm going to ride a horse because I can. And yeah, I think very practically. And what's interesting, even he's got and it wasn't like when he was writing the Pilgrim's Progress, I know he didn't feel like this is going to be my masterpiece, right? He's just writing, I think, because it's what he's got to do. I mean, most of the stuff he's written, you don't know anything about. Some of it you should know about, and some of it, honestly, it's fine you don't know anything about. But when he's writing Pilgrim's Progress, he's not thinking, oh, this is going to be it for me. This is going to be I'm going to sell, 500 million copies of this thing. It's He's just doing it because at some point he gives a copy of it to his friends, and he asks them, "Do you think I should publish this?" They say, "Buddy, actually, I'd throw it in a fire." Um, I mean, this is crazy. You're talking about King James Bible, number one most distributed book. Number two, Pilgrim's Progress. And he had some friends that were like, "Just burn it, man." Um, I can't remember their words exactly, but it was something like it's too whimsical, it's too imaginative. I just don't think people are going to resonate with it. He thought, well, I think it will serve some people in my church, and he puts it out there. I think he saw it well received. He did live to see it well received, but I think he would be shocked that we'd be reading it today. Um, I think he wrote it just to be meaningful to his people. And again, it's another great a great thing for us to think about in our Christian walk and life is you just got to be faithful. You don't know what thing you're going to do that's really going to resonate with somebody. And I will say it's typically not the stuff you think it's going to be. You'll do some grandiose thing and you'll think this is it, man. People are going to love this, and it just falls flat. And then a kind word, an encouraging letter, or something that you do that didn't seem to cost you much really resonates with somebody, and that was certainly lived out in in his life. Um, so Parliament. So when Charles II comes in, he decides this, and Parliament's like, hey, you actually don't have the authority to do that because what the Parliament's purpose is to make sure that the king doesn't have too much power. So when the king goes and makes this order, hey, we're going to undo this stuff, then Parliament comes back in and says, hey, you can't do that, um, and they cancel all these indulgences that were previously released. In 1777, he's arrested again, and that's where he's imprisoned again for 6 more months. Of course, he doesn't know. He doesn't get like, hey, this is going to be a 6 month deal. He'd likely be like, okay, I can handle this. I've done, he does 12 years in prison, um, but he goes back. And what's interesting, John Owen, the other Puritan, uh, can someone help me? The Owen's his book. It's Mortification of Sin. Yes, thank you. I mean, Owen's rich. A lot of these other Puritan preachers are rich. They can write because they don't have to work. I guess that's true for Bunyan too. I don't mean to laugh at that. It's awful. He was in prison, guys. Come on, you shouldn't laugh at that either. Um, but yeah, but Owen has this influence with these religious leaders. And he goes at this point in 77, he actually goes to one of the bishops and says, you got to let this guy back out of prison. And they say, why do you care? You've got all this theological training. You've been a seminary. You're a brilliant guy. You've got money. Why do you care about this tinker? And he says, Owen replied, may it please your majesty, had I the tinker's ability for preaching, I would gladly relinquish all of my learning. He said, if I could preach like that guy, I'd give up everything that I know. And so I love this. You do see this kind of connection between all these other guys. They've got an affection for Bunyan, and at that point they let Bunyan go. They let him out of prison, somewhat due to Owen going and lobbying on his behalf. So in 1678, he publishes The Pilgrim's Progress. In 84, he publishes Part 2. Other people started writing Part 2 to Pilgrim's Progress. Bunyan wrote Part 2 because everybody was like, he didn't want to write Part 2. A bunch of other people were like, hey, you got to give us what you think happens to all these other people. Because a bunch of people started writing Christiana's story. What happened to his wife? What happened to his kids? They had a lot of questions. And I'll tell you, again, Bunyan's, as you read these first two stages here, I remember when I read Pilgrim's Progress for the first time, I began to question my salvation. Because there wasn't a point where I felt this like massive burden on my back, like Christian is described. Christian goes along with this burden for a long time. He's aware, and then he goes to the foot of the cross, and this is released. And I remember thinking like, oh my gosh, like, did I not have enough awareness of my sin? Well, in part two, Christiana has none of that. Right? His wife, she kind of just thinks, hey, this is something I'm going to do. I'm going to go, my husband tried to tell me about this stuff. I'm feeling compelled. I think this is right. All right, I'm going to get my kids and we're going to go and we're going to do this thing. And there's no talk of her having a burden. And so in part two, it's really helpful because Bunyan answers a lot of this stuff. You see there towards the end of Christian's life, when Christian has gone through this whole journey and he's there at the celestial city, which is heaven, you've got some people that get to that point. There's a river that signifies death. You get some people that get to this river and they'll think, that's just sheer terror. And then some people that go to the river and they'll think, I'm ready. Take me home. And there's, you see in both part 1 and 2, there is a very pastoral way about Bunyan as he realizes my experience isn't everybody's experience. Now he'll talk about things like the interpreter's house or the hill difficulty and any number of things that are these are indicative of church. These are meant to signify something I think are objectively true. And then some parts of the journey are subjective. Some people have this experience, some people do not have this. And that's kind of the beauty in part 1 and 2 of Pilgrim's Progress, and it helps you see again the pastoral heart of Bunyan. And I think he felt that need to answer those questions. In 1687, James II issues a declaration for indulgence. It's highly contested. But then in 1688 is the year that Bunyan dies. What happens? Bunyan gets a call, obviously not a call. He gets word that there's a dispute between a father and son, and that they need help to resolve this stuff. And so he gets on his horse and he rides about 40 miles to go help with this dispute between father and son. He's successful. It goes. They're reconciled. This is great. He preaches, and then on his way back, this 40-mile journey, he's caught in a thunderstorm, and can't find shelter. So he's forced to just continue on horseback for the whole rest of the time until he gets back. He gets back to where he's going, but he's caught a fever, and this is the thing that kills him. After he gets the fever, he preaches on Sunday. He uses Christian's escape from the dark dungeon in Doubting Castle, and the dungeon of sin, and he speaks of the final glory and the resurrection of all believers. And then with some friends, but without his family, they don't even know that he's ill. His family doesn't know, but with his friends, they're gathered around him. He says, "Weep not for me, but for yourselves. I will go to the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who will, no doubt, through the mediation of his blessed Son, receive me, though a sinner, where I hope we ere long shall meet to sing the new song and remain everlastingly happy, world without end. Amen." He commits himself to the Lord, and he dies. Kind of an anticlimactic end to an incredible life, but somebody whose testimony is incredible. And he's buried just outside of the city gates of London at this time. He's buried in a place called Bunhill Fields with a bunch of other heretics. I say that tongue in cheek, obviously, but people that were nonconformists that were considered to be heretics. I've been to Bunhill Fields and seen Bunyan's grave, and it's probably better than most grave sites, but still not what you might imagine. It's just him. This is a big stone piece with him laid out on top. One side is carved into the stone is Christian with his burden. The other side is Christian at the foot of the cross, um, and just nestled under a tree there. But there's what's interesting. A lot of other people that we know buried in this same cemetery. Um, William Blake, the poet and artist, buried there. Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe, which is another book I commend to you, is buried there. John Wesley's mom is buried there. Hymn writer Isaac Watts is buried in Bun Hill Fields. And then John Owen, Bunyan's friend, buried there, and many other purists. So, or Puritans. So this is Bunyan's life. It's just not necessarily a part of his life, but right after his death, there's an act of toleration that passes and gives nonconformists the right to worship freely. But you hopefully, as you see Bunyan's life and you understand what he experienced, you'll see that in the pages. Again, I think Doubting Castle is a lot of people's favorite pictures from the book or scenes from the book, and you can see this experienced in Bunyan's life. And again, I think it's important to understand because it will help you know, okay, what is part of the Christian experience, what it was part of specifically of Bunyan's experience, and hopefully enrich your reading. It's changed the game for me, and knowing this about Bunyan and then reading these pages was really good. Questions? I want to share with you a few resources. This doesn't even touch my Pilgrim's Progress collection, but I'll have them up here for you. A few things I would highlight. There's this little book. I don't know if it's in print anymore, but I think you can find some used copies. It's not the text. This is by Leland Ryken. It's like a literary study, a study of the literature of Pilgrim's Progress. Because even non-believers recognize Pilgrim's Progress as a literary masterpiece. So he kind of hits it from that perspective. He is a believer. I think he was a professor at Wheaton. You can get that for a really good deal. Also, he's written a guide that's on the Gospel Coalition website. If you just type in Pilgrim's Progress, TGC, or if you type out the Gospel Coalition, it has a very exhaustive study throughout the entire book with links to other accompanying materials that are really good. Articles, a lot of the other books that I've read as a result of this I got from Leland Ryken. So anyway, this is a good little piece. This just came out. It might not be out just yet. It might still be pre-ordered. But this is daily readings from across all of Bunyan's books. If you get this, and if you get into it a little bit, this will help you dip your toes into some other of his books as well. This is probably my favorite thing I've read so far connected to it. Spurgeon was a huge Bunyan fan, and this is Spurgeon's writings and teachings on each individual character from Pilgrim's Progress. So even a guy that's kind of a throwaway character, if I can say that, like Help is the guy when Christian is going through the slough of despond and he gets to the end and they're getting all worried about how they're going to make it through. And Help is the guy that says, here, come this way. That's really the only time you interact with him. Well, Spurgeon, did like a sermon on the guy. So you can read. This has been awesome. It's really rich. It's put out by Banner of Truth. What's that? It's Pictures from Pilgrim's Progress by Spurgeon. Yeah, Banner of Truth. Anything you see Banner of Truth might be hard to read, but it's good to read. This is an interesting one. It's called Christian Life Issues. You wouldn't know this was about Pilgrim's Progress, but it's called Christian Life Issues. This guy is a biblical counselor. ACBC biblical counselor, and whenever he sits down to do biblical counseling with somebody, he's got his Bible and the Pilgrim's Progress. Those are his books. And so it's got the text from Cheryl Ford's edited version, which is a good version. And then it has a list of questions. So you've got the text of the book, and then these questions, really kind of insightful, thought-provoking questions. And they have part 1 and part 2 for this Christian life issues. This is Focus Publishing. They do a lot of counseling resources, and I'll leave all these up here for you. But there's also, if you've got young kids, there's this little book by Simonetta Carr. Simonetta Carr does a lot of church history stuff. They have a kids podcast called Kids Talk Church History. I will listen to it without my kids. The audio quality, kind of bad, okay? But we have grace, but the content is really good of this podcast. So Kids Talk Church History, but it's written by Simonetta Carr, and they cover all kinds of people. The episode last week was on this guy Javanel. You probably don't know Javanel from church history, but if you listen to Kids Talk Church History, you would know. But anyway, it's great. But Simonetta Carr's done a ton of these little books. It is really good. And then what I like to do with my kids, if you have young kids, we've gone through multiple versions of Pilgrim's Progress. This is a great way to cover any kind of literature with your kids. Certainly great books, and it's helpful to you. If you can read some of these books, buzz right through them, and then when you read like the real copy, it's helpful. But we'll start with kind of age-appropriate versions of the book, and then get increasingly, more elevated in the learning. The one my kids love, well, they've loved all of them. This is called Dangerous Journey. Like this is all taped up, but Dangerous Journey is it's definitely the best, like, very short version of Pilgrim's Progress. Like, I read this to my kids, we'd finished. The pacing of it's so good because at the end of every chapter, they were like, please, one more, just one more. They'll leave you on a cliffhanger every single time. There is you can find this, they put it to video. You can find it on YouTube, but it is like quintessential 80s Christian cartoon. Okay, so that's not a compliment. All right. So yeah. I mean, 6 to 8, definitely. I mean, Jenny was locked in when she was 4. With this. So then I couldn't find. I was looking for this. This morning, our version is called, the next one up from this is called Little Pilgrim's Progress. Little Pilgrim's Progress. They've got a big fat copy. It's got part 1 and part 2 in it. And it's kind of dumb, but it's okay. Just go with it. The only big change they make is that instead of it being Christian the man, it's Christian the rabbit. Okay. And Christiana is not his wife, it's his sister, and that's kind of weird, but, it's fine. But it's great. It is, I can't remember the lady's name. But anyway, Little Pilgrim's Progress is really good. There's Little Pilgrim Big Journey. If you start to look, if you want to get some of your kids, you'll see Little Pilgrim Big Journey. Has anybody read that? Okay. Not my favorite, but I didn't want to slam it if somebody's like, oh, I love it. But anyway, I've got these up here. If you want to look, there's some stuff just on people from church history. I have a book that's great. If you've got a preteen, this is Little Pilgrim's Progress Adventure Guide. So they can read the book, and then it just has, it's great. It's set out like, okay, here's some vocabulary. Here's some words that you're going to interact with in this chapter. Slough, obstinate, pliable, despond, symbol, What, and then it's like, take this, have this with you when you read, and then write out what you think this means. If you're, this would also be good for an adult. Okay, you just don't have to tell anybody you used it. Okay, that's fine. And then it's got a lot of reflection questions, some scripture to read. It's called Little Pilgrim's Progress Adventure Guide, and it will reference Little Pilgrim's Progress. There's a Little Pilgrim's Progress book version, and then there's the animated version. So if you have any questions, nothing would please me more than to chat with you about this book. We're out of time. Questions, comments?
Answers in Genesis has a really good dramatized.
Yeah. Have you seen it?
I've listened to it.
Okay. Okay.
It's with the original English, but sometimes it helps if you're listening to it.
Yeah.
Actually,
Hearing the different characters. No, they do, and they have a live action version that's been at the. I've wanted to see it. I just never worked out, but yeah, yes, yeah. I've seen that. I've seen that it exists. I've not listened to it. I've not seen one good movie of Pilgrim's Progress. If you know of one, I doubt it. No, no. If you know one, I'd love to give it a try. But I would steer. I don't know. I mean, there was one that came out recently, that like a computer animated version. I had really high hopes for. A lot of people were talking about it. It was awful. It was garbage. So, yeah. I mean, yeah. Anyway, so if you think, oh, I'll watch this movie, skip it. Just don't. Save your time. None of them are good. All right. Love you. Thanks. I'm excited. I hope to see you back in 2 weeks and read the book.